Hello, Leon. Welcome to the Transformational Learning Summit.
Thank you.
I'm really looking forward to our conversation. I've been really enjoying your book, Shift in Being, and I'd love to start with the question: what does transformation mean to you?
Yeah, just go for the biggest question, straight off. No chit chat, just straight to that big question. So the way that I look at it, and maybe a little bit of a layered answer, but I think the contextual piece is that there's often a bit of confusion between transformation and change. And I see that in the coaching world that I work. I see that in the leadership world that I work, where transformation is a wonderful word that's easy to attach to something to make it sound bigger or more impressive than maybe it necessarily is. Transformational coaching, transformational leadership, transforming organizations. But when I actually look at what's going on, I notice that maybe what we're talking about really is more change than transformation, because often it's what's occurring at a more surface level, the change or the development of whatever it is. It's a more surface level, and it doesn't get down to the roots, the real core stuff upon which systems and cultures and whole sets of behaviors are built. So when I talk about transformation, at least in the individual context, because as you know, I do a lot of coaching, working with individuals. So on a kind of personal level, I define transformation as a radical, revolutionary restructuring of our sense of self and our purpose and place in the world. So those words, radical, revolutionary restructuring, means that we're not just making change and growth at a more surface level, but we're willing to look at the deepest parts of ourselves. Let's call it like the inner operating system, the coding, if you will, upon which our entire life and our experience is built. And unless we're willing to look at that coding and to make change at that core level of mind and being, we're not necessarily working at a transformational level. We're working at a level of change. And so therefore, when I ask people, like, how often have you changed in your life? They can say, well, I've changed many times. Even just today, I changed. I grew, I developed, I learned. So it's something that happens frequently. But if I ask you, how many times have you transformed in your life? More likely you'll be able to count those times on one hand. You'll be able to say, well, I can pick a few times in my life when there was something radically restructuring within me as it relates to my sense of self and my purpose and place in this world. Yeah. So I'll leave it with that, because, opening gamut.
Keep it nice and superficial.
Yeah.
So there's two things that are emerging for me here. One is a question of, are we looking at basically the self-construct, like how I occur to myself, how the world occurs to me? And two is how, when you work with people, how do you get a sense of their, what might be called transformation readiness, that they're ready to begin to examine this territory?
Yeah. Maybe we can take the first question, because those are a bit different in a sense. So the first question, can you repeat that again? Just the first piece. The second was about readiness. The first piece was about the structure, or
about the self-concept. Are we really looking
the self-concept? Yeah.
How, when you talk about transformation in that way, what comes up for me is this in the territory of who I perceive myself to be, how I occur to myself, and how the world occurs to me?
Yeah, that's exactly it. So in psychological terms, the term is self-concept, which is a learned sense of who we are, what we value, what's important in life. And it's a learned sense in the sense that we're conditioned in so many ways to believe certain things, to value certain things, to see certain ways our culture influences us, our family life influences us. So in psychological terms, we grow over time this thing we're calling our self-concept, this learned, conditioned sense of who we are, and again, our purpose and place in this world. But what often happens in childhood is that a kind of ego shell forms around that. Because at some point, a child learns that, hey, I can be hurt and I have to protect myself. And so the ego becomes quite masterful at learning ways to create a kind of shell. I call these layers. You've seen my image before of like this onion, right? Where at the core is this sense of our true self. And then we build all these layers of ego around it. And that then can be called our ego or egoic sense self-concept or egoic sense of self. And it becomes quite a masterful structure that we then carry into the world. And it gives rise to our perceptions, yes, but it also gives rise to the very way that we experience the world, like your moment by moment experience of different things. For example, how much joy you experience, or how much stress you experience, how much freedom you experience, how much containment, like all these experiences that we can have in any moment. It's all kind of feeding that. And the more that it seems that our ego has a pretty strong grip on our self-concept, where it kind of rules the day in terms of how we see ourselves, how we see our connections with others, our relationships, how we see our work, how we see our value. When the ego has a really strong grip, it does seem that people become a lot more, let's say, fearful in the way that they experience life. There's more stress. There might be more disappointment. There might be more anger. There might be more hurt. There might be more disappointment, more guilt, more shame. Like these things seem to come up when the ego has a very strong grip on our sense of who we are. And as that dissipates through, let's say, a transformational journey, as we begin to connect more with the true self and that layer of ego, the shell pieces start to fall away, we then start to connect with the more essential truth. And in that there lies a kind of reality of, I am more than I ever thought I was. And this that I am is brilliant, bright, strong, resourceful, creative, capable. And we start to connect with that piece of ourselves. And so the self-concept doesn't really disappear. It's that it evolves into something that's more reflective of our true self and our true nature, rather than being reflective of our egoic sense of self, which is really about protecting in a world that seems like it can be of harm to us. So we protect ourselves in different ways. As you know, sometimes it's about putting on bravado or a persona or a mask that shows the world that we're something, so that we can feel safe, secure, successful. Yeah. So that's how the game gets played. But until we start to dissolve those layers of our ego, we're not able to then create a self-concept that is, as I call it, more soul aligned or reflective of the soul self, rather than reflective of the ego self. But once we make that shift, then it's when we start to notice these more expanded states of experience and consciousness, like, I can right now in this moment, no matter where I am, connect to joy or lightness or grace or ease just in this moment right here, right now. So I'll stop there, because you had this other part as well about, yeah, I forgot the second question already.
Before we bring up that question, I want to just go off of what you just said.
You have to forgive me. My headset has disappeared on me.
Okay.
So the fun continues today, Lorenz, with our conversation. Just give me a moment here to see if I can reconnect to why my Bluetooth disappeared on me.
I'm going to pause the recording for a second.
Just give me a moment here, right in the middle of all that.
We're back. Yeah.
Yeah.
So just going back to what you shared would you say this is an awareness-based process? Where you're basically
In what
becoming,
sense?
in the sense of first becoming distinctly aware of your self-concept as a phenomenon, and discovering all of these attributes that you might traditionally be identified with, like here's my emotional response to this person that's talking to me, or here's how I respond to this situation, or here's where I'm attached to this. So becoming aware of those dynamics, and before they necessarily might dissolve or might not dissolve. There's a concept in your book that I really love, which is, I believe you said, it's something that is no longer or not yet, being in the space
Yes.
of no longer, where you're no longer quite identified with these things, but maybe you're not quite fully liberated from them either. So you're aware of this
Yes.
self-concept. It's still very much present in your kind of being space, but yet it's kind of transitory. So I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, that's also known as the liminal space, what I refer to as living between the no longer and the not yet. And you're right, it is a process of self-awareness, but maybe it's a space of very expansive self-awareness. Because I think to some degree, anybody who's on a journey of learning has a degree of self-awareness. Even if you're, let's say, learning to be a better salesperson, or you're learning to be a better communicator, or to be a better parent, that doesn't always mean that those deepest parts of our self-concept are being attended to. But we are learning and we are growing, and we can change some of our behaviors and our patterns of thought and thinking. But when it comes to this idea of transformation, we're really moving into expanded levels of self-awareness. And what happens then is we start to notice all the ways that we have been, again, conditioned to think about ourselves in the world. And that's mingling with all the ways that we might be noticing how we want to grow and learn. And there might be in those moments a kind of rub where the thing that I thought I mattered to me, the thing that I thought I should care about and value, that I was taught was so important in life, be it making money or wearing good clothes or being a caring, giving person, I was taught that was important kind of thing, is bumping up against my new sense of self, that there's something in me that's just deeply authentic that wants to show up, that's stripped of all that, this is how you should be, and just is as I desire to be. And in that moment of those two bumping up, there can be a recognition of what you're calling the letting go, like something now then of that old conditioned self needs to be let go of. And what is that I'm ready to say, this is no longer me? At the same time, there is this sense of, well, there is something emerging, but I'm not necessarily rock solid clear on what that is yet. What is this aspect of my more authentic selfhood that is beginning to reveal itself in my, let's call it awakening mind, but I'm not yet living it. I'm not yet the embodiment of that reality yet. There's still a lot of the old stuff that's got a grip, whatever that may be. And so in that tension, that is where we call what we call the liminal space, where we live between the no longer and the not yet. And that's where the really hard work begins for most people. Because what has a grip has a vested interest in maintaining a grip. It's got no real vested interest in just casually, quietly leaving the building. So our ego sense of self and all of its structures that have long provided us with safety and security and even a sense of purpose in this world are now being threatened. And of course, it's going to say, well, no. There'll be none of that letting me go. And the ego will kind of put up its own kind of resistance. And it will show you that the way that you have been living for so long under its care, under its protective shield, is the way that you want to continue living. You don't want to go down that pathway of discovering authentic truth and power within yourself. You don't want to go there. That's too risky. Let me just show you that this way that we've been living, where you kind of guard yourself against the world, where you wear certain masks, where you act in certain ways that bring you accolade or power or recognition or validation of your worth, this is the way to live. So you're wrestling with all of that still. And at the same time, there's this pull to these higher realms of self-knowing. It's like, but what is that? I'm not really sure. So people struggle for years and years, often learns in this space called the liminal space, with these two differing aspects of themselves that seem to be kind of at war with each other. And in a way, they kind of are. Yeah. Like the butterfly analogy.
Mhm.
I love that. I love that story. Like, I think it's just the most apt metaphor that we're working with to describe the human experience of transformation. And I write about this in the book, this idea that in a butterfly, or rather a caterpillar becoming a butterfly, there's no morphing process. I used to think they morphed. I actually never really looked at it carefully, and I just thought the caterpillar morphed into a butterfly. It was only much later when I learned that the caterpillar actually dies. So there's a death process occurring, and they become a kind of puddle of primordial goo. Death and decay. If you were to cut it open at that moment and look at it, you would just see gleh in the middle of this cocoon. And you'd think, oh, there's nothing happening here. This thing is good and dead. But then what happens is in the middle of that primordial goo, one day, mysteriously, a cell pops up. Ping. And then immediately all those old dying cells, which still reflect the old immune system, will pounce on that new cell, thinking it's some kind of an enemy cell, and smother it. And then ping, ping, some new cells. And again, this dying, fading immune system is still doing its thing. It's jumping on these new cells and snuffing out their existence. Until ping, 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 so many cells start popping up that this immune system can't quite fight to the same degree. Then these cells start connecting and they form different parts of the caterpillar, kind of cell clusters. And eventually those cell clusters form into parts. And then the caterpillar eventually becomes the butterfly. But it's a real death process, a death and a reemergence in this liminal space called the primordial goo. And I think this is so apt as a metaphor for our own transformation as well, because we must go through this death of the old self process, which is not comfortable, which is going to rage against the dying of its death, which is going to pounce on all this stuff that emerges from us that may be of this more evolved, evolutionary, awakened self, and pounce on that and say, that's crazy. You don't want to go there. You don't want to think those ways. That's just woo-woo. That's out there. You want to stick with me. Until eventually this new emergent self would become so vast, so complete in the mind, that that old defending ego just can't really hold it anymore. And it just begins to loosen its grip and loosen its grip and loosen its grip. Now, it's not the perfect metaphor because ultimately, I think the ego, the human ego, never disappears. I don't know what you think about that, but for me, the ego, it's more like it's relegated to its right place within our life experience. And I say right place, mean the ego still has a role. It still has a function. Like the ego allows me to see you over there as you and me over here as me, as separate beings. Like my ego is my sense of separate self, that I'm separate from everything. Whereas my soul is my sense of unity self. I am connected to everything, and everything is connected to me. So as my self-concept recontextualized from an ego-based one to a soul-based one, it moves from one that is seeing myself in this world needing to survive in a world that is separate from me, where things don't necessarily work with or for me or for my greater good, to a world in which I see everything as intimately connected, as one within this greater tapestry of life, of which I am an essential ingredient, as are all people. And all of us are connected in some kind of a dance of creation that we don't yet necessarily fully grasp. So that transition has to happen for us. And when it does, as I said before, our self-concept tends to more reflect these higher states of understanding. And we start to feel much more positive flows of energy and potential within us. But just coming back to that metaphor, you can see that little dance of death and decay and emergence happening as all part of the necessity of living in the liminal space.
I I often think about the ego as a naturally occurring phenomenon. It's just something that's there. And sometimes, the ego gets this bad rap and you hear people talking about the ego like, oh, that's my ego, it's bad. And I always have reservation about that because it's like, oh, you're just gonna it's like that's your ego in expression. It's even in its last like mechanism of defense is to other itself in a way. It's to put you in a position of judgment and othering of the ego. I wonder, yeah, how that lands with you.
That's exactly it. Like I look at the ego as a gift of life. I look at everything in that way as a gift of life. Now, how does it serve us then, is the question I want to ask. Well, it has, it seems, a key role in our evolution as a species on the planet because it cares for our survival. And survival is a mechanism that perpetuates humanity and it perpetuates my existence. So first I need to learn to survive, often before I can learn to thrive. So the ego plays to me an essential role in telling me all the ways that I am vulnerable, that I can be hurt, that the world is against me, that I am not unified with you. And therein lies a tremendous amount of learning. Oh my goodness. But if I don't see it that way, if I see the ego as the bad guy, then you're right. It's just another layer of judgment. And some people say, well, the ego is the problem and we need to vanquish the ego. I'm not so sure about that. What I look at it is, how do I just dissolve its grip so that it is relegated to its rightful place in my life, which serves an unending purpose. And when it has that, right place in my life, it becomes the servant of my soul rather than the driver of my life experience. So I'd rather look at it that way than judge it as the bad guy. It doesn't seem as helpful.
Do you have a particular philosophy or approach to giving people a direct experience of that? Like I often find in these conversations, or every once in a while I'll have one of these conversations and I'll encounter somebody who we start talking about ego, and I have this experience that it's such an intellectual process for them. They're like, oh, my ego is bad, it shouldn't be there. And so it's all in their head rather than a direct experience of, oh, there's this self-concept here and it's constructed as a response to life. And, it's just something that's there, but I don't have to be that. But that, you can have that conversation and that understanding at an intellectual level, and then you can have it at the level of a more direct experience. And I find that for me, that's such a curious territory, is how do you traverse that gap between an idea of something, so many of these transformational teachings start in this space of idea, like what the ego is and isn't,
yes,
whether it's good or bad, and then bring it into the direct experience of something.
Yes. I find that when we do the deep coaching work, when we create a container or a space in which a person feels really safe, I mean, they have to feel really, really safe to go inside and look at themselves and to look at all, let's say, the shadowy pieces of their self-concept, their self-worth, all that ego stuff. What normally happens is that they seem to move into a space where everything is just accepted. You know what I mean? Like the space itself has to be one of just pure acceptance, if not love. Like at least me as the practitioner can try to hold that for them so that they can experience what absolute acceptance feels like, even as they may be looking at and rejecting parts of themselves. There's still a container of absolute acceptance and love, which is built in. Acceptance is built into that. And when people feel that anything that they put on the table, anything that they shine a light on in themselves that may be of what they're calling their shadow side or their ego is held in absolute acceptance, then it becomes an experience in which even the ego is accepted. And we don't even need to intellectualize it anymore. We don't even need to talk about the ego and what it is or isn't and how we define it and what it does and all those things. We can simply say that is that experience is of my ego or generated by my ego. But wow, just look at it. Just look at it. Look at all the ways it's trying to play this little game with me right now, and all the ways it has played a game with me right now. And we start to kind of smile a little bit, chuckle, if you will, at the silliness of ourselves when we dance in the ego's light, but we're not judging the ego any longer. So to answer your question, I think it comes back to the quality of the space or the container that allows a person to lean in to that part of themselves in full acceptance and allowance in order for that judgment piece to kind of, move aside.
It's something really profound in what you're saying. Just in this moment, I've been going to Burning Man for a long time, 14 years, and I often think about what is it that makes Burning Man what it is, and one of the elements that's there is this element of radical acceptance. In some ways, Burning Man is a total freak show, but in another sense, everybody is feels absolute permission to just be themselves, to just accept themselves, and there's something about that that's so healing and in some ways absent in our social spaces, and to be in a space where you feel comfortable just being yourself, that's like incredibly healing.
Yes, immensely. And we don't, as you said, we don't get that often because we live in a society, a world, even in friendships and families, in which there are expectations, there are upheld values that we must meet. And we must try to live into their ideas of who we need to be. It's all kind of a pressure that we all experience. And so it's a really rare gift to end up in a space in which you feel right away, wow, I could literally say anything. I could do anything. And I would be held in acceptance for that. And that's what then allows people to look at their darkest, shadowiest parts. Like, for example, sexuality or sex in general, for most people is quite a challenging topic to really reveal in a more, no, let's call it a more public space, like with a coach or in a group context, except in some rare ones, like let's say a group for sex addicts. Obviously, they're going to be talking about sex, but so So I'll give an example. Like I had a client once who was having some issues around in his marriage, feeling sexually fulfilled. It dovetailed back to his childhood where father left the home quite young when he was young, and he became at 9, a parent to his siblings. He was raised mostly by his mother and his aunt. He was seen as one who's very capable of solving problems and, kind of expected to take over the father role in the family. And as a result, through his teens and his 20s, he was spending his whole life just doing what was expected of him to maintain the family. And he didn't really date. He didn't really have any sexual experiences until his early 30s. And he had this long feeling of like, I've just missed out on a really big part of my life, which for, others in their teens and their 20s, they're dating, they're experimenting, they're doing whatever. He missed that. And then he got married. And that piece was just gnawing at him. Now, to be able to talk about this is one thing, like to be able to bring that to me and start to say, this is a big missing in my life. This is a big hole that I don't know how to fulfill. It's a hole that, let's say, my spouse is not really understanding. And one of the things that he wanted to do is he wanted to go to swingers clubs, and he wanted to experiment with those kinds of things with his wife, but he wanted to do these things. Now, I'm just bringing this up because the moment you say in some context, oh, I want to go to a swingers club, you're going to get a lot of different kind of judgments in that moment, right? A lot of people some will think, oh, you shouldn't do that. That's terrible. Some will think, oh, that's awesome. Do that. Some will think, boy, I wish I could have done that. Whatever, you're going to get a lot of different opinions and judgments. That's the normal social kind of reaction to if someone says that. But if you're coming into a container in which there's none of that. It's just a held space in which you can literally just be with all of that angst, all of that turmoil, all that pain of what was felt like it was missing in his youth, all of the yearning for it to be different with his spouse now, all of the yearning for what could be if only we could do these things together, all of that. Like there's a massive amount of tension in that. And a lot of self-doubting and self-denial and self-loathing sometimes. And all of that comes in, the guilt and shame, and should I be feeling this? And right now, imagine just sitting in a container in which all of that can just be voiced, leaned into, lived with, loved, accepted. So I'm not there to guide and give advice as to what he should do. It's to give him a space in which he can come to some sense of clarity and how he wants to move within all of this, but also just to be able to like quell all of that discomfiture to the point where he has access to something that's really true and real for him, through which he can then begin to act in his life. And I think that's such a powerful, powerful thing to offer people, no matter what the topic is, to bring guilt, shame, all those things to the table and just know it is all part of our human experience. There's nothing here that other people haven't for centuries experienced in every shape, color, and form.
I love that, and I want to acknowledge that we're talking about this in the context of, say, a one-to-one coaching relationship, but I feel like these dynamics that we're talking about, and also that was you could say an extreme example, but I feel like there's versions of that are present in almost every social context, whether it's in a family, in a workspace, in any kind of community, whether, who doesn't have subtle frustrations that are voiced because you're afraid of how you'll be judged, of how it'll come across, of how it'll land, right? There's, for me personally, I feel like 99% of the social issues out there are issues because there isn't a space that can hold the conversation about them. There's nothing, people feel so bad about having a thought. And it's just that they don't have a space where that thought or that emotion or that orientation can just be witnessed, just be normalized in some way, allowed to be held. And so this is a big thing I think about in the context of group spaces. I know a lot of the work that you've been doing is more one-on-one, and I wonder if you have any reflections on bringing this quality of acceptance. And I guess the other dimension of acceptance is maybe capacity to hold something. Maybe you're saying something and I can, it pushes the edges of what I can accept, and so there, or it just also ruffles me in some sense. And so I also have to have the capacity to be able to hold it without trying to fix it, change it, diminish it, push it aside. So, I wonder, what are your reflections on any dimension of what I just shared, cultivating this capacity for acceptance and capacity period in a group space or just between two people?
Yeah. So I'm thinking of it from, let's say, a facilitator perspective, someone who may want to facilitate experiences where people feel that level of acceptance, or where a group of people feel safe enough to really start to touch some of these core aspects of their life and share them with each other. So how do I facilitate that? Because deep coaching is still a facilitation method in the sense, but this idea of group comes into it. So what I'm thinking, let's just sit with that for a minute. The group, which way do I want to approach this first? I think I'll come at it first from the sense of capacity of the facilitator to be intensely present in that space with these other people and not be triggered. I have heard and seen over the years when the facilitator who has convened this experience is in some way triggered by what the group is doing or not doing, or saying or not saying. And there's different reasons for why that person can get triggered. For example, I had a client just the other week share with me that she had a 2-day workshop that she had planned for her group. And her whole goal was ease and grace. I want to be ease and grace for 2 days. Day one was a day of conversation and holding space And ease and grace, she said, was present all day. But day 2, I had to have them learn something. And I wanted them to learn something. And I was frustrated before we came to this gathering that they hadn't yet learned it. So I had a little bit of an agenda. And ease and grace left the building. And I was tense. I was nervous. I was snapping. I was the complete opposite of ease and grace on day 2. Even some of the people came up to me and said, "Who is this person? You are so different than yesterday." So we get triggered by our group. We also get triggered by, in a sense, our own agendas not being fulfilled within the group. But the facilitator is key to it all. Presence, being intensely present to just what is in others. And creating within yourself a space of just extraordinary allowance. Now, this can bump up because so many facilitators say, well, I want to get this done, and I want to talk about that, and I want to make sure we get to this in this thing that we're doing. And that can get in the way right there of allowing a conversation to meander where it needs to meander, or for a person to have an experience that they're having. So I was leading the deep coaching intensive in Bangalore as an example. And I had this section on being with pain. Like, how do we be with other people's pain? This is a big trigger. Other people's pain triggers us out of a space of just simply being with. Maybe we start asking questions. So I was talking about what it is to be with pain, to allow others to just be with their pain, to be in the discomfort. And one of the participants started telling us her grief story about her 22-year-old son who had died 6 months earlier unexpectedly. And her grief was immense, the scale of grief. So there's 24 people sitting in the circle. I have my agenda because this is a 20-minute part of my agenda, for example, right? I've got this in my head. And she begins to just grieve. And I could feel the group becoming antsy after a certain amount of time. At first, you could sense the group is tolerating, maybe even allowing and accepting. But after a bit of time, I could see people, fidgeting in their seats a little bit, sideways glances to me as in, what are you going to do about this? This is going on a little bit too fervently and a little bit too long, Leon. I'm not comfortable anymore. This is not about me. So I had an opportunity in that moment. I could either give in to these little cues that this is not right, this is not on, this is not acceptable in a training program, or I could hold the ground. And in that sense, I meant this is what it is to be with pain. And just hold it. Not flinch in the sense of give in to any of these. Can I just be with her? And I held it. I think it went on for an hour. On an agenda level, it disrupted my entire agenda. Out the window for the day. But that was the learning. For everyone to witness and to feel what it is to hold the ground of unbridled acceptance for another human being in that moment, to release all my agendas for the day, to trust that this moment right here, right now, with this person giving this level of emotion and grief in a group space is exactly what we all need to experience to understand this practice of being with pain. And what your word capacity, the practice is to expand my capacity to be with more and more pain. Not to bear it, not to be triggered by it, but to simply be with. So it was this amazing learning opportunity. So there is a capacity piece, and all of those people in that room that day, I believe, had their own capacity expanded to move even through their own kind of squirming of discomfort to move back into a place of holding. And that's often the journey for the learner coming into this work, is to move through all of their own internal squiggling to be able to hold the ground in acceptance of what is arising, and trusting that arising is exactly what's needed for all. So I'll pause there. Yeah.
Something so humanizing about that, about just being with another person when they're suffering without trying to deflect it or diminish or somehow, move on from it or try to fix it, just being with them.
Being with them, yeah. For sometimes as long as it takes. And this is where we get in the way again. Oh, well, as long as it takes should be an hour or some construction of time. A client comes back repeatedly grieving in our space or repeatedly going over the same painful story. And by the third time we think, yeah, but you're just going over the same ground. And maybe they are. I'm not saying that they're not doing that, but that becomes a judgment then, which often then leads us to a place of maybe not accepting the person as they are anymore, because we've judged that to be, well, repetitive or not really what we're here for, or whatever the thought may be. To just be with. It is incredibly humanizing.
And there's something also about, the implication here about appropriateness, which I feel is really interesting, because part of the disconnect in social spaces is that we've deemed all these things to be inappropriate. It's inappropriate to share what's really present for you, or the frustration or the pain that you feel, or the deep challenge you're having in a family situation when you're at work, or when you're in some sort of social space. And to some extent, maybe that helps you be more productive, but I really question that. I feel like it actually, in the end, radically diminishes our capacity to be truly collaborative and co-creative, because those capacities are functions of our authentic presence with each other, authentic connection with each other.
Yeah. The appropriateness. Just that word. Is it appropriate? Oh, that's not appropriate. Oh, well, then I better be appropriate. And yet it seems what we need now on this earth, more than anything, are these kinds of spaces where people can show up fully as they are. And that might be in their anger, in their rage, it might be in their joy. But to also recognize that that is a self-expression moment, as in, we're creating a space for you to self-express here. Now, your self-expression isn't necessarily the truth of others. Your self-expression is not necessarily to be imposed upon others as the way they ought to think. So there's still a piece in this too, I find, when you talk about bringing it to the group, where we want to anchor people in their own truth, but not necessarily is their truth the truth of others in that space. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, the word that's present for me, and I want to come back to it, is appropriateness, because it's an interesting word, because in that context of my truth and the truth of others, in the context of a space, there are levels of appropriateness. There are levels of, and I don't know if I'm going in a different direction from what you were saying here, but I'll just...
No, keep going.
There's something about the container and what is appropriate to it that is important in the mutual holding and kind of co-respect of what we're holding here. So there is an element of appropriateness, but it's slightly different than what we often think of as appropriateness.
Yeah, there's a difference. You want to try to articulate that difference? That's because it's subtle.
It's elusive for me. I wonder, I can feel it. I can. And that maybe is an interesting dimension in this conversation as well. Some things maybe we try to feed into understanding through some sort of intellectual approach, and some things are very readily felt. Not that they can't be intellectualized or conceptualized, but they're felt, and it's very present for me when I feel safe to just be myself, to be authentic
Right.
in the context of what's appropriate, because I'm, you know, my stepping into any space, even you know, someone's living room, involves all sorts of implicit agreements that, you know, don't need to be spoken to be understood. And so there is a certain level. I'm not going to get naked in my neighbor's living room because I feel like getting naked. That would be really inappropriate. So there is implicit appropriateness, and there's some sort of felt territory of what what feels appropriate.
What feels appropriate, right? Exactly.
Oh boy.
Exactly. It's a good one.
Yeah, yeah.
When I talk about the one, let's just call it the one image of appropriateness, there feels to me a rigidity around it.
Mhm.
And I've always felt that rigidity and the human process don't go well together. So the sense of rigidity, maybe somehow it's wedded to judgment. Appropriateness that is, I don't know, just the kind of appropriateness that we're talking about isn't this rigid
It's not
thing.
repressive. It's not repressive.
Yeah, it's not repressive. The idea is that it helps create the fabric of a container in which we're seeking a certain kind of experience. Right? So when we recognize what is appropriate, maybe it's more that than it is what's not appropriate.
Mm.
Maybe we're naming, maybe that's the difference. The not appropriate versus the is appropriate. So if we just name what is appropriate, the appropriateness of a certain attitude, a certain word, a certain gesture. When I think about how, for example, I don't know if you're familiar with open space technology, Owen Harrison's work. Okay. So I always love the opening kind of ritual, if you will, of a holding space meeting, if you will. And the way that the facilitator then very gently kind of lays down the principles. My favorite being like the law of 2 feet.
Yeah.
If you're not learning here, if you're not learning and growing, contributing here, you take your 2 feet and you point them in a direction where you are learning, growing, contributing. Okay. You know, just kind of laying down the appropriateness of that in the sense of this is what we're upholding. And because I find a good facilitator present in the moment, embodying the principles, not just going through a series of words that says what it is, but is the living embodiment in that moment of open space, is pointing to a paradigm that says this is what we're seeking to uphold today. And I've never been to an open space in which, when it was done well, didn't automatically fulfill its vision. So maybe that's the piece. Then there's the other side of the, well, this is not appropriate. And so I've never been to a holding space that's done well, in which the person simultaneously listed out 10 inappropriate things, right? That's not a part of how an open space experience is constructed. How that paradigm is, it's not about the poster that has the 10 inappropriate things. It's only about the paradigm of what we are creating together. And when the facilitator embodies that, it happens. It happens almost organically without really much effort. We get it and we move into it together. So I'm sitting with that idea, this idea of what, you know, creating the paradigm of appropriateness first through the vision, the embodiment of it on a being level versus the pointing out what's not on. We shall be having none of that. As a different kind of way of asserting appropriateness.
Would you put this in the category of creating a container?
Yes, it's all part of that, creating this container of possibility.
Mm.
Yes, yes, exactly.
I
think the more we are
of possibility
of possibility, yeah, containers of possibility, paradigms of possibility. I think that's what we're doing when we're giving rise, again, using this holding space analogy or situation where, we're giving rise to a possibility within a group of people. And we're doing that by, for me at least, it's embodying what it is to hold space. I would never talk about holding space without trying to be the living embodiment of what that means, to hold the space and to open the space in which people feel the space is open. I mean, the idea of open space is this absolutely gorgeous self-organizing behavior that is just unleashed with so very few limitations and constraints on what can happen in that open space. And I think we then, when we do that well, when we bring the fullness of ourselves into it as a group, when we have perhaps a set of appropriateness guidelines of what we're trying to create together, then we are creating a container where a certain kind of possibility can emerge. It's a paradigm, and we're solidifying that paradigm. And I don't know if there's room in that then for that list of things that are inappropriate, which could be a mighty long list. If you really were to brainstorm a list of all the things that are inappropriate in this setting, we could come up with a mighty long list, but we're not going there. Now, why don't we go there? Well, maybe it's not appropriate, I suppose, but on the other hand, it doesn't feel like it's serving, it's not serving this paradigm that we're creating together. I don't think people understand necessarily that piece about paradigms of consciousness, that we're constructing something together, but we don't see it as a construct. Sorry, but you're going to say something. Go ahead.
We're constructing something together, but we don't see it as a construct. No, I'm still sitting with this word of appropriateness, because it's such a rich territory. I really appreciate that. Oftentimes we're stuck in these spaces where the appropriateness is something that's suffocating. It's somehow constraining the space. It's not it just doesn't feel appropriate to really share what's present for you, or you're in a meeting and something's coming up for you, it just doesn't feel right, but because of the power dynamics in the space, it doesn't quite feel appropriate to just be authentic and present. And so there's a really interesting richness around perhaps even articulating that territory of what by default may not feel appropriate, as a statement of permission. Is like, we're in a space here where maybe this doesn't feel appropriate, but we really want to invite this other quality of being. We really want to invite you to feel comfortable to say something that might be present for you, or something like that. So there, the appropriateness expands into something different. It's about appropriateness towards what's conducive to really opening up the space and reaching the intention of that space, or something like that.
Yes. I think that's exactly what I'm saying as well, right? What's appropriate to reaching that condition,
That possibility.
Space, experience, possibility that we are aiming to achieve together.
As an expression, I guess I would add, as an expression of our authentic being.
Right. Which is not the paradigm that many group gatherings want to create. Many a meeting has been held where there's nothing to do with the expression of the authentic part of our being. We just need to come up with some solutions to solve that client's problem. We don't need to really be authentic being here. But when you name that, then that changes things, doesn't it? When you name part of this work, part of us coming together, is to be authentic with each other, to drop those parts of ourselves which get in the way of authentic relation, of acceptance, those parts of ourselves that tend to judge, and to really be with each other as we are, and to invite people into that. And from my experience too, like even when those things are named in that way, and even when the facilitator holds that as their reality for the group and therefore the possibility, I still have seen conflict arise. You've probably seen it too. Not necessarily between the facilitator and the group sometimes, but often between people of the group. Like some argument will arise, or some debate that becomes a little bit too aggressive. And I find that interesting as well. because then what do you do? What's the appropriate response to the arising of aggression in a context like that? Or the arising of, well, I'm offended, or I'm put off, or you're not really hearing me, or whatever that triggered person feels in that moment. Now, well, what's appropriate there? What are they now allowed to do that they're triggered? Right? If it doesn't meet this paradigm that we've just created of, yeah.
Love that. So, and I feel that um, in relational spaces, if we're inviting authenticity, and this is my personal philosophy, but if you have a relational space where you're inviting authenticity, the depths of authenticity eventually reach, some kind of trauma territory, and those things come up, and that's part of, almost like the example you shared with the person sharing their grief, then that if you're creating a space like that, you can expect that things will come up. And part of the realness of that space is the way that the space or the people in the space respond to that. When in one of our recent cohorts of our transformational experience design program, we had a group that actually had a significant rupture, and one of the members ended up leaving the program. And it was really, we did our best to hold space and to navigate all of that. But in my observation is, even in the most well-facilitated transformational awareness-based relational spaces, things come up.
It can happen. Absolutely. I don't know. Are you familiar with M. Scott Peck's 4 levels of community building?
No.
Okay, so M. Scott Peck wrote the book Road Less Traveled, American writer. He's just a gorgeous writer. I love his work. Oh, it's just so gentle and always just almost poetic in his writing. But in the 70s, he was really into community building. And he wrote a book, I think it's called A World Awaiting to Be Born. And in this, he, through his community building experience, lays out his 4 stages of building authentic community. And I don't know if you're familiar with this. I can share them really quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
Because it points to this, what we're talking about. And so he called the first stage something like, I may not have the exact names, but something like pseudo community. So pseudo community is when we get together as a group and we are all getting along because of societal convention and etiquette and polite behavior, or in the workplace, professional behavior. So we keep kind of conflict at bay and we get along and we function. Everything's quite good. But it is pseudo community by his term, because it's, in a sense, still surface level ways of knowing and engaging.
Very appropriate.
And he says, yeah, very appropriate, right? And most of our engagement, as you know, is in this form in life, right? But then he said, the next stage, if a group's, kind of moving towards community, true community, he says, is the stage of conflict. Because he says, eventually, a group together is going to start to realize, hey, I don't really like you that much, or you trigger me, or you offend me, or whatever the behavior is that you're doing to me. And conflict starts to form. Sometimes it's just differences of personality. We just get along with some people better than others, or some people we don't want to be around as much. So this naturally begins to happen in any group that kind of moves together for a while. The societal norms and etiquettes start to crumble a little bit, and conflict arises. And he says 3 things happen. One of 3 things can happen with a group that goes into conflict. The first thing is they're going to try really hard to go back to pseudo community. In other words, somebody will hold up a sign that says, hey, that's not professional behavior. We need to get back to professional behavior so that we're engaging in this way with each other again. So that's one thing. They'll sort of hold up the norms of how we should be engaging back to pseudo community. The second, he says, is that the group will break up. They don't want to be around each other anymore. Well, this is a toxic environment. I'm leaving. And the group breaks up. But he said the third option, and this is the path towards true community, is that the group will lean into the conflict and go into the third stage. But he says normally for a group to go from the conflict stage into that third stage, it does need an experienced facilitator. Someone who, again, can hold the ground and who sees this conflict thing not as inherently bad, which we are so somehow programmed to do, right? Conflict bad. So wait a minute. Conflict is just revealing the cracks in our community. It's not itself inherently a bad thing. But so many people see conflict as bad because it's not what pseudo community upholds as an ideal, that they run away from it. But if you can lean into it, and an experienced facilitator will encourage the leaning into, what is really encouraging is every individual to lean into their own shit, to lean in and go, oh, okay, I'm saying I'm offended by you, but let's be really honest. My entire life experience is my responsibility. So what in me is going on here? And we begin to really look at our own shadows. And he calls that stage something like letting go. So finally, a group, individually and collectively, learns to let go of all of that which stands in the way of authentic knowing, acceptance, and community. And then the group finally moves into stage 4, which he calls true community. So now we're in true community. Now, interestingly enough, he says no true community is self-sustaining for long because they're open systems. So eventually new people come in and we get tossed back into one of the earlier stages and the community has to kind of refine itself back. So it's a constant kind of loop into this, but the idea is that we're open and willing. But that's this whole point, is that conflict, then we have to see it as absolutely a normal, if not necessary, part of getting to something called true community.
It's almost in that frame an entry point to connection. That's the kind of paradox of it is, and I think about this about almost any relationship, like friendship or whatever. You meet somebody, it's all good, and I feel like those levels almost apply to almost any relationship. Like you have your friends that you've met, and you're good, you enjoy each other, everything's great. You're maybe a little bit polite, but until you have like a real conflict, a real challenging situation between two people, I feel like that relationship doesn't quite progress to this next level of friendship. Someone you might call like a deep, I hesitate to use the word best friend, but in that territory approaching like best friend, someone you might approach about your deepest problems or challenges or whatever, like somewhere in between normal friend and best friend, there's a challenge or conflict that you overcame that actually like opened up that relationship for you.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, isn't it? And if we don't run away from it, if we lean into it,
you have that choice that happens, and then you can break away or lean into it, and that's what makes it relational glue. Right.
And often it requires one looking at oneself. It doesn't help much to walk across the street to your friend and say, see, you're still the problem.
It's all you.
It's all you. Like I've discovered that. Yeah, it's all you, and here are all the reasons.
And I discovered that I'm awesome.
Yeah, exactly. I was told by my coach that I'm magnificent light at the core of my being, so it must all be you. So you're right. So you see it when you lean in and you recognize how responsible we are for our own experiences, and we do the work. It's not easy sometimes. It's not easy, is it? Then we go and we extend the hand of true friendship.
What's your definition of responsibility?
That's a good one. I'm not sure I ever thought about that one in much detail. I can only really talk about it in terms of myself. To be responsible to something. When I talk about taking responsibility for myself, it means that I own my experience. But no one else is the master of my experience. It's a kind of a sense of autonomy there, that I am an autonomous person and that I am responsible for my life in every way, shape, or form, particularly the experience I'm having in any moment. Even this experience with you right now is mine to have. So that's what I mean by responsibility, is that I can, in a sense, I own it. And I'm not assigning anything to anyone else in terms of how I'm feeling right now. You could decide right now to curse me out and call me a snake oil salesman. And in that very moment, I could either kind of be triggered by that, say, wow, what an impolite host he was. I couldn't believe he did that. Be all, you know. But then that too is me. So that's what I mean. I am an autonomous human being in that sense. So responsibility really means just recognizing that.
You're the chief meaning maker.
Yes, I am chief meaning maker in every moment, an experience feeler, if you will. Right? Whatever emotions I'm feeling right now, the energy that flows from my body, the thoughts that arise in my mind, the words I communicate are all part of this that I am. So, and I'm responsible for that. Now, if other people get triggered by me, I cannot be responsible for that. That doesn't mean I don't watch what I say. It doesn't mean that I'm not cognizant of the effect of my words in this world. And that if I choose to create a certain kind of experience for people, then it behooves me to learn the words and the attitudes and the energies that create that experience for other people. And so what I'm choosing to create for other people, whether they do it or not, it's up to them. But what I'm choosing to try to create for other people is an experience of authentic selfhood, an experience of being accepted, an experience of being loved and lovable and loving. These are the things that I'm choosing to help other people experience. And so I want my words, my energies, my deeds to reflect that. But I'm not responsible in the sense that I cannot make them choose these things. Yeah. But that's also part of my responsibility too, is what is it that I desire to create in this world as an experience for others? And if I desire to create antagonism or to create a sense that they are inferior or that they are wrong in some way, then I can go about creating that through my words, actions, and deeds as well.
And there's also this is bringing finally back, and this question is back in my mind, you know, for the last hour, because I offered you 2 questions in the beginning, right? Remember? And then we went one direction.
One way, yeah.
And that other question has been sitting there. I was like, when am I going to bring it back? So I'm bringing it back now.
Okay.
Because I feel like this comes full circle, because part of that responsibility is also the responsibility of receptivity, of being receptive to where a person's at, to maybe what's appropriate for them, to what they need, to how you can really be in service to them, to your own expectations of them, to be aware of that. And so that comes back to this question of, I guess, transformational readiness, or, you know, how do you sense where a person's at? You know, even in these, we're using these words like responsibility or awareness or, you know, acceptance, and I think a lot of these things kind of occur on a spectrum of discovery for a person, where they really begin to discover these things, and then to possibly deepen those discoveries into more embodied understandings than just in their mind. And so I wonder what your reflection is on encountering a person and where they are in terms of their, for lack of a better word, transformational readiness.
Readiness, yeah. That is actually, I think, a part of the artistry of the work that we do, which I call deep transformational coaching, is that we do have a conversation around discerning the readiness of another person. Because I often tell the students is that it's these magical moments of expanded consciousness and healing often happen when the readiness of the client meets the capacity of the coach. Like when those two intersect, magic happens in these spaces. But if the capacity of the coach is not there and the readiness of the client is there, well, it's not necessarily that nothing happens, but it may not be that sweet spot. And the same, if the client's not ready, the coach could be as ready as the day is born, as the massive capacity. But if that person's not ready for a deeper dive, or to really look at some of these aspects of themselves, or even to embody higher states of awareness, then all the capacity in the world doesn't necessarily make any difference, because they're simply not ready. And one of the problems for the deep coach is that they'll often try to pull people into readiness. My thought is, well, this really would be good for you if you went there with me. And I really like to go there. I love this work at the deeper levels. And I really want to pull you there. And then resistance sets in because the person clearly is not ready and not necessarily willing and is confused by what the coach is doing. So this idea of how do you discern the readiness of someone for the deeper dive is part of the artistry of this work, so that we're not pulling people into experiences that they may not be ready for, or even trying to impose an experience, or even a question upon someone who may not be ready for that yet. And one of the issues, and I've noticed, is that people who are on this transformational journey are so alive in it, so in love with it, that they want to go there with everybody in their life. Well, my family's not going there with me yet. And I just find it hard to sit with my family over dinner now with these superficial conversations, and I don't like it. I just want to talk about. Well, the family's not ready. And maybe they're not even knowing you in this way yet. They don't even necessarily know that this is what you're yearning for, because maybe you haven't even revealed that to them. So there's all of this. So your question, how do you discern the readiness? No easy answer. As I said, it's an artistry piece. I have gained a sense of that readiness by working with people in this way for a very long time. Like thousands of conversations like this, but on a personal level. And over time, by listening to people, you kind of begin to get a sense of what are they aware of in themselves? What are they tapped into in themselves? Are they tapped in at a soul level? Are they listening there? Are they still guided primarily by the things of the world, the way the world thinks they should act? Are they still responding to and the inner calling of the ego to show and prove their worth, to show and prove their value, their capacity? You can hear this in the way that people speak. You can also hear it if people avoid going deep at any time. Like they just brilliantly manage to keep the conversation at a very surface level all the time. And even your own curiosity into their lives gets closed off pretty quickly. I don't know if you know people like that, but I certainly do, because I'm a very naturally curious, inquisitive person who wants to know people's lives. Like I want more than anything else in the world just to be in your life with you for a while, just to experience your life and to hear you talk about it. I don't necessarily need you to go anywhere or do anything with it. I don't need you to change. I just like to hear your life. And some people will readily share that when they're invited to. And I don't mean coaching clients. I just mean conversations every day. They'll share that. They're feeling heard, they're feeling witnessed, and they want to share. And I love those moments. But I have just as many friends that I know that will just close that door. And they're still good friends. I still very much enjoy the superficial conversations with them because I have no need for them to be different. But I can sense right away that this is just not a place they're willing to go, at least with me. At least with me. They don't want to go to that. So it all kind of helps me discern. Sort of, are they asking themselves the bigger questions about life? Are they pondering life's meanings? Are they pondering, what am I here for? What's my purpose? Are they questioning the way that society organizes itself and the values that construct our world? Are they pondering big questions? That's always a sign, right? What are they really looking at? Are they questioning themselves, my role in this, my responsibility to the world, my purpose? Are they articulating that? That's another sign. Are they ready for healing? Do they talk about their shadow side? They talk about their limitations and their desire to overcome them or move beyond them or transcend them. Do they talk about these things? If they do, another sign, something's going on there at a deeper level. Do they talk about soul, spirit, spirituality? Do they care about these things, right? When they do they come to life? Do you see them become more animated, more real? Another sign. Something's going on. So I'm paying attention to all these signals and signs, of which there are many, but kind of begin to just gently reveal that person's readiness for a deeper dive. Yeah. And that's the artistry.
Do you think, so the other side of that, let's say in the context of a group space, what are your reflections on somehow guiding people towards more readiness. If you're in a space,
Yeah.
if you're in a space where maybe this isn't a natural way of being, where people are more guarded and tend to kind of operate at a more transactional level.
Yes.
How can the readiness of that space somehow be opened up?
Yes. So it begins, I guess, with the intention for the convening of that group.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what is the stated, declared intention for the convening of that group? So you can think of all the different group sittings that we end up in. Sometimes it's a business context where we're there to have a meeting about something. Other times it will be a meeting to talk about our lives. Other times it'll be a group getting together to open Christmas presents around the tree. Like, what's the stated? So it begins with that. I've always noticed, and again, this is open space stuff, learnings from Harrison Owen, sorry. Set up that, get the topic clear, get the intention clear, what we're doing here. And I notice that when you do that well in advance, people come, in a sense, primed for that intention. So I have a meeting, for example, with my staff at the beginning of the year, and I can say, well, it's a staff meeting. We're going to talk about the things we did last year a bit and what we're doing next year. That's one way. And then they all come with the mindset of this is, but if I shift it a bit, just a little, we're going to review what we did last year. We're going to look at the year to come. But most importantly, we're going to reconnect with each other, kind of set our own visions and intentions that really matter to us within the context of what we're doing in the coming year. Now they come in primed differently. Mm-hmm. So that's why I say that's a big piece in creating the experience. But then you and I, we've talked about setting ground rules or guidelines, if you will, how we open and we begin to construct that paradigm of possibility by revealing the potentials of that group. So if it is indeed to have people feel safe, to be able to open up, then those have to be articulated intents as the group convenes. And the facilitator has to be, for me, the living embodiment of these things. That they're not simply paying lip service to some ideals, they are that which they articulate. And when I notice that I am that which I articulate, there's a trust that goes to me from the group that this human being is not paying lip service to somebody else's ideals about what a group could be or do together, but is actually it. He is acceptance. He is trust. He is allowance. He is openness. He is honest. He is authentic. He is that. And he's inviting me to be that as we set the frame for the conversations. Then that trust goes out and the group begins to look at each other a little bit differently. And maybe I can drop my guard a bit here. Maybe I can be a little bit more revealing. And then there's and that's a really critical piece, isn't it? To set the container well and to take time doing it. And if it's about safety or about making sure people feel safe, you have to address it. We are here so that we can open our deepest part of ourselves to each other. And you have to be safe with each other. We hold confidentiality here. We want people to feel, and I learned this phrasing from John King, this author. He says, "Your life is safe in my mouth." I love that phrase. Your life is safe in my mouth. That's exactly it. That I can share with you my life and it is safe from that. Like those kind of pieces have to be built in. But in deep coaching too, we spend so much time creating presence, like what it means. I don't mean to be present as in I'm here now. I mean the presence of the coach, the presence of the facilitator. So we work on a series of practices, like what it means to slow down, to become spacious, to allow silence, right? To create an energetic cocoon that is healing. Yeah, so the more that this is embodied by the facilitator, that too is brought to the group, and the group will experience it immediately. Again, if it's just lip service or if it's the embodied reality of that human being. I think the more that we can do these things, we can create that container. And we have to hold that. Like I said, that has to be held through the experience. Any wavering from the facilitator will disrupt the experience in the group. Like my example of my client who went from day 1 to day 2, that wavering of her immediately impacted the whole group. They all wavered. They became, she said this to me, she said, the moment my day 2 kicked in which I was not ease and grace, they started falling asleep. They started looking at their phones more. They started going for snacks and coffee more often. They had more bathroom breaks. They started squiggling in their seats more. Now, this is all unconscious behavior, but it was all, she said, absent on day 1. Like, explain that to me. So somehow they're picking up what you're bringing in and reacting to it. So it's all in the facilitator, right?
I'll add the other side of that is, of course, as every facilitator is, we're all human. And I feel like if, you know, in the case of a facilitator dropping the ball, one amazing recovery approach is just to be authentic about it.
Yes. Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Like totally real about
exactly.
it. And
yeah.
in my, I always, and this is actually my secret kind of like philosophy of facilitation, is that whenever something goes wrong, or I miss something, or I do something, the benefit is that it's always an opportunity for connection through the way that I own it authentically, through the way that I have an opportunity to just be real about something that I might have dropped or didn't quite feel right, or maybe it's something that came up for me and I got, you know, mildly triggered by it or whatever. But if I can just own that and speak that into the space, all of a sudden everyone's like, oh, he's
Yeah.
human.
Exactly. Exactly. You don't need to put up another pretense that I've got this. I don't want them to know that I've wavered. I've got this. But I don't want them to put up any pretense, but I'm going to put up some pretense. You know? Yeah.
There's so much about this, I feel like it's just about being okay with yourself. You know, and I wonder like how that lands with you, because we're talking about this liminal territory of, you know, like no longer, not quite there yet. I don't know if I quite said that right, but there's part of that is you just got to be okay with yourself at some level and just accept everything going on with you internally, and allow yourself that humanity, and somehow that
Yes.
actually creates the conditions for you allowing the humanity of someone else.
That's it, isn't it? It's exactly it. Radical acceptance of self equates to radical acceptance of others.
And that's the revolution.
Right? Yeah, that's what revolution is. Yeah. And what's funny is that when you take that to its extreme, you think, well, the more I accept myself, the more I'm going to accept what Putin has done. Wait a minute. Wait a minute. Wait a minute. No, 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 no. No, no, because what he's done is madness. You know, I've just done, like, I just swore at some people. Okay, that's all I did. But you know what he's done? And I felt guilty about that. But so this idea of radical self-acceptance, we start to extend that out. It's like, oh my goodness, that means we have to really create a container in which all is allowed and accepted as it is. The most horrific of our human tendencies and our most beautiful of our human tendencies are all housed in that. And people sit back like, whoa, I don't know, really? Like all of those negative tendencies? Are there some that we could judge and say that's not on? Well, on a personal level, are there still some things that you judge as not on in yourself? Like, oh yeah, maybe there still are. Huh. And they sit with that for a moment. How do you accept it all? And yet this is what, you know, when I read, when I think about what love as consciousness is, like love consciousness. Like I'm really a big fan of Dr. David Hawkins' work, Power versus Force and Levels of Consciousness studies. And He puts love at a very high level of human consciousness. Interestingly, coming just after reason as a level of human consciousness. So reason very high as well, but love transcending reason. And to sit with what love is as a form of human consciousness, like, oh, that's all accepting, utterly all accepting. Huh. On a universal scale, accepting.
I like to think that the universe never ejected anybody.
Ever.
You don't belong here. Get out.
Right.
Yeah. Never
It just doesn't,
anybody.
it doesn't. It's not possible to conceive in that way when you scale your consciousness to that size. When you start to recognize that everything is self-generated in terms of experience. And even the most horrific acts done do not need to penetrate that. Like I don't know about you, but I'm not a Christian, but I was raised in the Christian faith when I was young. And one of the pieces that always strikes me as fun to look at is that Jesus Christ was the living embodiment of love, as is said. Now I'm holding that and I said, so this man shows up as absolute love everywhere he goes. And there was still a group of folks that decided to kill him.
Well, that's because it's revolutionary.
It's revolutionary. And love was seen as something so out there, so threatening. So it's like, okay. But in that moment when he was being crucified, his last act was simply one of more love. Just more love. That part of him wasn't penetrated. It wasn't pierced. It wasn't dissolved. Even when the most horrific acts were being perpetrated. And so this is what I then hold up as this idea of love as a consciousness force. It's that really nothing truly can harm it. Nothing truly can derail it. Nothing truly can penetrate it. It is simply that which is. And all of this humanity that we experience, all of it is held within that level of creative mind. It's like, whoa. So what if I was that? Well, that would simply mean the world could be as it is. It could do whatever it wanted. My equanimity wouldn't budge a millimeter. Just like, it's just that. And that's all I want to experience. That's all I want to exude. That's all I want to communicate. That's all I want to experience. And you guys, the world can do whatever it wants. In any way, it can blow itself up, and we'd be sitting there going, wow, what a cool explosion. It's it's that level of acceptance. It's radical beyond belief. But so often we don't accept ourselves to that degree. We still reject our shadowy parts, and thus we reject the shadowy parts of our humanity across the board.
Yeah, and what's present to me, what you shared, that there's a vast difference between acting in the world from a place of judgment and condemnation and acting in the world from a place of acceptance and purpose. Because you can still feel a deep calling to be in service of something, to somehow shift something without condemning it. You can be with it and be an agent of transformation, and that's a very different place to operate from than the place of othering and judgment and shame.
Exactly. And that's a big lesson to learn, because it's easy to judge and shame, to see others as less than, inferior, not worthy, and then to hold ourselves up as the paradigm or paragon of enlightened living. Look at me, I'm so woke. It's like, really? Is there judgment in you? Oh, a lot. Well, let's see.
It's good to own that judgment. Leon, thank you for this conversation. I really appreciate the many territories that we've covered, and that we ended on this unconditional love. That really is you using the paradigm of possibility, and think That is the possibility. That's the paradigm of
That is-
possibility, right? Really
It
living
is
into
it.
possibility of unconditional love.
Yeah. And I still hold that this is the current kind of leading edge of where we're going. In other words, it's still so out there for many that it's not yet really understood on a mass level. Like, in other words, this is our learning edge collectively.
Mm.
It's a really good one to position yourself on the edge of, because you're kind of at the vanguard of this ideal, but to make it practical and pragmatic, right? It's not about some woo-woo-ness, unconditional love. It is, what does life look like in that paradigm? Practical, functional level. Okay, good question.
Mm.
Right?
Yeah, that is the question. And it's so
Yeah.
practical. It's not woo-woo, you know, and I think that's
Yeah.
the misnomer of people who think spirituality is some like alternative way of life. Spirituality is
Oh.
being in life at the deepest level of experience and taking responsibility.
Thank you
Thank
for
you
saying
again.
what is truth.
Really appreciate our conversation together.
Absolutely. I did too. In every way. Thank you.